Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. He knows that we have no idea where DNA came from. He knows that the origin of life is still unexplained. And so this is the perfect gap for him to insert his God into.
You have a huge problem.
All he needs to do is erect this intuitional point about complexity equaling a designer.
The moment you see a word, you immediately know that whatever natural processes are involved in putting this picture up on the screen, there's a mind behind it.
And then he points to DNA and the complexity that resides therein.
3.4 billion letters in the right order.
And bingo, you've got a God. But I'm not going to let you away with that, Lennox. I'm not going to allow that to happen. That's not going to happen on my watch.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arrows.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all most welcome to another episode of The Most Annoying Religious People. Up for today is one John Lennox, a mathematician, bioethicist, and Christian apologist to boot. Quite the resume, if you don't mind my saying so. Guys, according to Mr. Lennox, atheists have a problem, and he's the best one to explain what that problem is. As per usual, you can be the judge, but let's listen to what he has to say. Take it away, Mr. Lennox. Take it away.
Often I challenge my fellow scientists and I say, what do you do science with? I do it with my brain. Now, I do not believe the brain and the mind are the same, but that's a debate for another time. Let's agree with them, we do it with our brain. So I said, tell me the brief history of the brain. And often they'll say something like this: the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and I say, and you trust it? And I've done this with many people. I said, look at this computer. If you knew that it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I always force them to an answer. I've always, without exception, got the answer no. And I said, I see you have a problem. A real problem.
These scientists you're speaking with, Mr. Lennox, must be straw men. Don't you just love it when Christians relay anecdotes about imaginary atheist scientists who don't really exist? I don't buy for a second that he's had a conversation with atheistic scientists who said that the brain or the mind, assuming they're the same thing for the moment, I don't buy for a second that he's had a conversation with an atheistic scientist who said that the brain and or the mind are the product of a mindless, unguided process.
And often they'll say something like this: the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process.
They don't think that. No atheist I've ever met thinks that. Evolution and natural selection are mindless, sure, but they're not unguided. Natural selection is the guide. It's about survivability. Nature selects for that which survives best. It's that simple. This isn't an unguided process. It very much has a guide. It's a mindless guide, you're right about the first part, but unguided? That is bull. That is not true, Mr. Lennox. So I don't know who these imaginary straw men were that you were speaking to, but I have a very strong suspicion here that you're just telling some tall tales here so that you can erect a straw man, knock it over, and declare victory. And this computer analogy is just appalling.
Look at this computer. If you knew that it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it?
Far from what Lennox is looking for here, all this analogy does is serve to shine a light on the straw man that he's erecting here. Let me throw you a bone, Mr. Lennox. Let me extend an olive branch, because I agree with you. I wouldn't trust a computer that was the end product of a mindless and unguided process. But I submit to you, what if the computer in question was the end product of a mindless but guided process? And what if that guide had at its epicenter? What if that guide's function, what if that guide's operational mechanism was such that it helped the computer to get better at its job over time? What if the guide improved the functionality of the computer such that it can fulfill its function more effectively? Might you be tempted to trust the computer then? I know I would. So while the mechanism at play in this analogy is mindless, it certainly isn't unguided. In fact, the mechanism as I've described it could reasonably offer the user of the computer some confidence in their device. Put another way, it could give the user a sense of trust.
Would you trust it?
Because the mechanism itself helps the computer to improve over time. It helps it become better at doing its job. And so too it is the case with the human brain. The human brain is the end product of millions of years of evolution. Now, I'm not suggesting that human beings have been around for a million years. The top-end estimates suggest that human beings have been around for about 250,000 years. But of course, our ancestors have been around before us, and so on and so forth into history. So again, I repeat, the human brain is the end product of millions of years of evolution. And evolution's operating mechanism, the algorithm that's at play, is natural selection. Natural selection chooses that which is best at surviving. So then the question becomes, would a brain that can interface with its reality effectively, would a brain that can interpret reality accurately have a survival advantage over a brain that cannot interpret reality accurately? I don't think I need to answer that question, dear listener, but just for the sake of being thorough, let me give you that answer. Of course, the brain that can interpret reality accurately is going to be better. Of course, that brain is going to be better at surviving. The brain that can better interface with its environment is going to survive. That is a fact, and this is precisely why we can trust our brains. And need I mention that there's an embarrassment of evidence that our brains interface with reality effectively? Do I need to go into the examples? The fact that I can navigate my environment and not fall off a cliff, the fact that I can step over a rock or climb a mountain or drive a car, all of this demonstrates that my brain is successfully interacting with my environment. Not to mention the sciences, the fact that we can discover great and penetrating truths about the cosmos. There is an embarrassment of evidence which suggests that our brains can be trusted. Our brains are obviously interfacing with reality successfully. Now, do our brains do that in every context? No. Reality can be quite mystifying to us. A low-level example could be something as simple as an optical illusion, like when you see water on the road at a distance on a hot day. Again, an optical illusion. But the more serious example of this is something like quantum mechanics, which completely challenges our understanding of the world around us. Clearly, the world doesn't always map onto our intuitions, and in some sense, we're probably not evolved to understand things at the quantum level. Fine, but does our brain work at interfacing with reality, just generally speaking? I think yes. The evidence is considerable. And again, the reason our brains are good at doing this is because our brains are the end product of a mindless but guided process, the guide being natural selection, which of course selected for brains that can better interpret reality, because that obviously leads to survivability. So again, John Lennox is guilty of a big, fat, ugly straw man here. He tells this, completely, I think, fictitious story about these scientists who say that the brain is the end product of a mindless and unguided process.
And often they'll say something like this: the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process.
But of course, that straw man is completely false. And of course, it's completely and ridiculously easy to knock over, which is precisely why John Lennox phrases it the way he does. The truth is, our brains are the end product of a mindless but guided process. And that guide, if you don't mind my saying so, did a pretty good job of producing brains that can interpret reality. In fact, our brains can interpret reality so well that I'm easily able to identify the straw man that's at play in the reality of Mr. Lennox's argument. This is just ridiculous, folks. And as always, you can be the judge. That's my 2 cents. Let's hear what he has to say next.
You see, this has now moved into mainstream of the philosophical argument. So let's go. They often ask me where I get the argument, because they see I'm not bright enough to think of it for myself. Well, that's okay. So I said, I got it from Charles Darwin, actually, and that surprises them. With me, he wrote, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. And that leads Plantinga, and we'll go back to him, to point out the deep conflict between science and atheism. If Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he's given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties. This is Darwin. And therefore, inevitably, to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own atheism.
There's just so much wrong with this that I don't even know where to begin. Again, you hear this re-articulation of this point of view that if the mind is the product of an unguided process, then why should we trust it?
If Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he's given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties.
But as I've already pointed out, this is a straw man. The mind, if indeed the evolutionary explanation is correct, the mind is not the product of an unguided process. It's the product of random mutations. Sure, they're unguided, but then they are acted upon by a very specific guide, that being natural selection. Natural selection being that process by which that which cannot survive is selected against, which is to say, dies.
Most evolutionary biologists today don't believe that.
Don't believe what?
They don't believe in random, so this crude fundamentalist version of random selection that you propose.
I do not propose it, and I strongly deny that evolution is random selection. Good. Evolution is non-random selection.
Well, so there's a purpose to it, is there?
No.
Could you explain what non-random means?
Yes, of course I could, as my life's work.
It's a hard thing to say, but keep it brief.
There's random genetic variation and non-random survival and a non-random reproduction, which is why, as the generations go by, animals get better at doing what they do. That is quintessentially non-random. It does not mean there's a purpose in the sense of a human purpose, in the sense of a guiding principle which is thought up in advance. With hindsight, you can say something like a bird's wing looks as though it has a purpose. A human eye looks as though it has a purpose, but it has come about through the process of non-random natural selection. There is no purpose in the human sense. There's a kind of pseudo-purpose, but it's not a purpose in the human sense of conscious guiding. But above all, I must stress that Darwinian evolution is a non-random process. And one of the biggest misunderstandings, which I'm sorry to say the Cardinals just perpetrated, is that evolution is a random process. It is the opposite of a random process.
Let me give you a very basic possibility here. Let me give you a very basic hypothetical. Let's imagine at one point in the distant past, minds did not have the capacity for basic arithmetic. Okay? Let's imagine that was the case. So counting was outside the bounds of possibility. Then let's imagine that there was a random mutation that allowed brains to count. Which of those species, which of those creatures would have a survival advantage? The question is, does basic arithmetic give a creature an advantage in its environment? I would say the answer to that is obviously yes. Being able to count confers a survival advantage because that allows you to count your resources. It allows you to count the amount of food. It allows you to count the amount of people in your tribe. It allows you to plan. It allows you to anticipate, right? Being able to count and engage in basic arithmetic confers upon a creature a whole host of survival advantages. So obviously, natural selection would favor the creature that can engage in basic arithmetic. That creature would be more likely to pass its genes into the next generation. The creature who was incapable of arithmetic in a scenario where arithmetic would be very useful would be less likely to pass its genes into the next generation. Ergo, you produce a survival advantage and a species that's going to proliferate, and hence arithmetic becomes a commonality in that species moving forward into the future. This is a very basic hypothetical, but it gives you some sense of how the mind could develop over time and how the mind could become adept at interpreting the environment and engaging in an observational, I dare say, almost scientific process of observation, falsification, and learning. It's not at all difficult to explain how, in theoretical terms, the mind could emerge and get better at interpreting its reality over time. My little hypothetical isn't the best one in the world, but it gives you some sense of the kind of process that I'm thinking about here, dear listener.
The moment you see a word, you immediately know that whatever natural processes are involved in putting this picture up on the screen, there's a mind behind it. You immediately intuit that. It's a perception that's automatic and universal. So I say to them, look at that menu, and if it says roast chicken, I say, look, how do you know it's roast chicken? Well, I've learned English. Okay, R-O-A-S-T, 5 letters. They're semiotic, they carry meaning. Now you explain to me, if you're a reductionist, you explain to me that word and its meaning in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper. Nobody's able to do it. They can't do it because they have to postulate mind. Now, if you have to postulate mind to explain that, even though many physical processes are involved, with a 5-letter word, what are you going to do with this? Which is just about 3.4 billion letters in the right order. If you take the reductionist, materialist, atheistic view, I will say to you, you have a huge problem.
Again, there's so much to respond to here, so I'll try to break this down to the best of my ability. He alleges here that we intuitively recognize that words are the product of intelligence.
The moment you see a word, you immediately know that whatever natural processes are involved in putting this picture up on the screen, there's a mind behind it.
I already have a bone to pick here. This isn't intuitive. Absolutely not. The reason we recognize words as being the product of intelligence is because we have an absolute embarrassment of evidence that suggests that words come from intelligence. If I'm walking along the beach and I see the word love drawn into the sand, you're quite right, Lennox. I'm not going to assume that that is the product of mere chance. Why? Because I know that the word love is a product of the English language, and I know that the English language is the product of human cognition. So when I see that word love drawn into the sand, I make a reasonable inference. I don't engage in an intuition. I form a reasonable inference. My inductive reasoning kicks in, which is to say, all of the knowledge of my past experiences comes to bear in this moment. I am aware that people go to the beach. I'm aware that human beings speak English. I am aware that the word love is a word in the English language. And I am aware that children and adults and all sorts of people draw things in the sand on beaches because I've seen that happen hundreds, if not thousands of times in my life. All of that information comes to bear. All of that inductive experience comes to bear in that moment. And so I form the reasonable hypothesis that this word that is now etched into the sand before me, even though there's nobody around in this present moment to confirm it, I can still form a reasonable conclusion based on my past experience that this word is the product of intelligence, a human mind. Now, you might be wondering, dear listener, why I'm putting so much energy into resisting Lennox's point here. Why wouldn't I just grant him that it's an intuition that's at play when we recognize that language is the product of intelligence? Well, I'll tell you why I'm resisting this point, and it's because I know the game that he's playing. The intuition that Lennox is referring to is the intuition that complexity requires an intelligence. That complexity can only be explained through an intelligence. Because, of course, we know that DNA is complex, and we know that words are complex. And if we just call DNA a language, or even if we didn't, its complexity on its own would be enough to get us to the existence of a designer.
Now, if you have to postulate mind to explain that, even though many physical processes are involved, with a 5-letter word, what are you going to do with this? Which is just about 3.4 billion letters in the right order. If you take the reductionist, materialist, atheistic view, I will say to you, you have a huge problem.
But the truth is, guys, complexity is not how we recognize design. That's what Lennox wants us to believe about the word on the beach. That's what he wants us to believe about the word roast chicken in the menu. The fact that it's complex and conveys meaning, the fact that it's complex and can be interpreted and conveys information, all leads us to the conclusion that a designer or an intelligence is involved, or so Lennox wants us to believe. But as I've already pointed out, it's not the complexity of the word that leads us to the conclusion that it was the product of intelligence. It's our past experience. It's the evidence. It's the embarrassment of evidence that leads us to the conclusion that the word on the beach or the word in the menu is the product of intelligence. So the question then becomes, is there any evidence that the complexity of DNA is explained with reference to an intelligence? And the answer to that question is no, because we do not know where the first self-replicating organisms came from. We don't know how life began. Biogenesis or abiogenesis is hitherto unexplained. We do not know. It is a gap in our knowledge, which is exactly the game that Lennox is playing here. He knows that we have no idea where DNA came from. He knows that the origin of life is still unexplained. And so this is the perfect gap for him to insert his God into.
You have a huge problem.
All he needs to do is erect this intuitional point about complexity equaling a designer.
The moment you see a word, you immediately know that whatever natural processes are involved in putting this picture up on the screen, there's a mind behind it.
And then he points to DNA and the complexity that resides therein.
3.4 billion letters in the right order.
And bingo, you've got a God. But I'm not going to let you away with that, Lennox. I'm not going to allow that to happen. That's not going to happen on my watch. Watchmaker. Kudos to you if you recognize that philosophy joke. In any case, guys, no, I cannot allow him away with this. You see, guys, this is why it's so important to delve into the minutiae. This is why it's so important to delve into the details. All you would have had to concede in this discussion with Mr. Lennox is that we recognize that the words roast chicken are the product of an intelligence because they convey information and because they're in a specific order. In other words, because they're complex. All you would have had to do is concede that one seemingly irrelevant point, and then suddenly you would be duty-bound to accept his conclusion that DNA must therefore, by extension, be the product of intelligence because of its complexity. But the problem, guys, is even deeper than that, because he's referring to DNA as a language in the first place. Now, I grant you that DNA, under a metaphorical framework, could be conceivably referred to as a language. It would depend on your definition of what a language is. DNA is a biological signaling system, and if that rises to your definition of the word language, then sure, DNA is a language. Fair enough. But that doesn't get us to a designer. Again, guys, DNA is not explained. We don't know where the first self-replicating organisms came from or how they came about. It is a mystery. And the fact that it is a mystery does not mean that Lennox's God explains it. That is a textbook argument from ignorance fallacy. Mystery, therefore God. You can't explain it, therefore God. And that's precisely the game that Lennox is playing here.
You have a huge problem.
DNA, depending on your definition, may be a language, but if you're going to call it a language, you must understand that that is being deployed in a metaphorical sense. There's not literally letters and numbers or words floating around in our bodies. Yes, DNA is incredibly complex, and yes, we have attributed letters to it in order to explain and understand it, but it doesn't literally mean that there's words, billions of words, or a billion long chain of letters floating around in our bodies. That's not the case. Those letters have been ascribed by human beings. Please notice that we could have used other symbols and ascribed different symbols to explain DNA. We could have used bloody hieroglyphs. We could have used emojis, right? Instead of A, we use a smiley face, right? Instead of G, we use an angry face. We could have used any symbology to represent DNA in written form in our notations, but we decided to use letters because we're human beings. There's not literally billions of words flowing around in our bodies. DNA is a signaling system. It's a biological mechanism that is very well understood. And on that note, there are, as it so happens, very robust, detailed explanations that biologists have produced which explain in part how DNA may have evolved over time through purely naturalistic processes, through evolution and natural selection. A mindless, guided, not unguided, a mindless, guided process, the guide being natural selection. Again, none of this requires a mind. Its complexity does not point to a designer, because complexity does not necessarily lead to an intelligence. We are talking about biological organisms. Darwin's theory of evolution explains how very simple biological matter can become more complex over time. Darwin's theory of evolution put the final nail in the coffin of anybody who wanted to articulate biological complexity as evidence of a designer. I'm sorry, but that case is closed. And just because there are still mysteries remaining about where the first self-replicating organisms came from or how they came about, just because we haven't explained the origin of life, doesn't mean that God is responsible. But let's move on.
If you take the reductionist, materialist, atheistic view, I will say to you, you have a huge problem. And this is one of the reasons why I'm fascinated by the Genesis account, simple account, but it's brilliant, that talks about a word-based universe created in a sequence of speech acts, and God said, and so on. This is profound stuff, and I wish I had time to explain it to you. You may want to ask questions about it, but the critical thing that's being explained is that our universe is not a closed system of cause and effect. It's an open system into which God speaks. There's an informational input from the mind of God.
And then the Christian does what they always inevitably do: return to their book of magic spells. Profound? I mean, look, fair enough. All textual criticism is subjective, right? All critique is subjective. The movies you like won't be necessarily the movies I like. The songs you like won't necessarily be the songs I like, etc., etc. But goodness gracious me, your opinions on Genesis are very interesting. Profound, you say. This is where all Christians return. So he tries his best to make this rather sophisticated linguistic argument. He talks about DNA. He talks about how the complexity of words and the complexity of the DNA structure and the human genome all are powerful evidence for the existence of a designer. And after all of this loosely scientific babble, he returns to that same fountain that every Christian inevitably returns to, the Holy Bible. The Holy Bible. And he just starts preaching and giving a sermon on Genesis and what he thinks about it and why he thinks it's profound.
This is profound stuff.
And of course, because the entirety of his speech thus far was about words and how words convey meaning and how naturalists can't explain that and how words obviously mean that there's an intelligence involved and DNA is composed of words and so therefore there's an intelligence involved, yada, yada, yada. And so, of course, he makes a big deal out of the Genesis account and how God speaks reality into existence. This really is the bottom of the barrel, and that's the reason I'm taking the piss out of it. So, in other words, the veil has been dropped. He was speaking in his capacity, or at least loosely speaking in his capacity, as a scientist and as a person with expertise in biology. But always and inevitably, the veil of logic, the veil of scientific language, the veil of a loosely rational case eventually and inevitably drops to reveal what's really going on here. That this man is a man of faith. He believes what the Bible says. And now he's going to preach and give you a sermon from that Bible. It's just so typical. And it's just so dull. And that's exactly why I'm going to move on.
As a scientist, one of the most resonant statements that makes sense of the world as I see it, the world of science, is this: in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him. And without him, nothing came to be that came to be. If something comes to exist, we always ask for a cause. The universe came to exist. You came to exist. And what we've got to look for is an explanation that makes sense. And I believe that the word-based universe idea makes perfect sense. But then that raises an even bigger question, because the biblical claim is that the Word became human and dwelt among us. That raises a series of huge questions. It's the reason I'm a Christian.
And in closing, Mr. Lennox, we are agreed. The explanation for something should make sense. And so the question becomes, does your explanation of reality make sense? Remind us again, what is your explanation? A spaceless, timeless, immaterial mind brought everything into existence by merely speaking. Makes sense. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You see what I mean, dear listener? How the veil of rationality just fell away? And now we're just in Bible class. Yes, we are agreed, Mr. Lennox. The explanation for what's going on around us should make sense. And you know what I mean by that? I mean that the explanation should avoid mere assertions. I think that the explanation should avoid fallacies. I think that the explanation should avoid religious sermons. All of the very things that you're engaging in. Show me the evidence of a spaceless, timeless, and immaterial being beyond mere assertion. Show me the evidence beyond a mere God of the gaps argument. You spend most of your time in this soliloquy talking about DNA and the origin of life because those things are as of yet unexplained. Your fellow Christians in an earlier time, in a time gone by, spent their time attributing the variety of life to God. But now we know better. We know that evolution explains how life proliferated and changed over time. Your brethren in the past explained bloody lightning with reference to God, but now we know better. We have an entire history of religion, an entire history of Christianity more specifically, where your fellow Christians, where your brethren, your Christian brothers and sisters in the past, filled the gaps in our knowledge with God. And here you are, Mr. Lennox, doing precisely the same thing. Precisely the same thing, only this time it's with DNA and the origin of life. If and when science explains where the first self-replicating organisms came from, you'll just place God in another gap, and on we'll go until the merry end of time. This video really is a tale as old as time itself. And I suspect, long after I'm gone, theists will just find another gap to insert God in. There will always, however, be atheists like me who will resist. And I thank you, dear listener, for joining me in that resistance. And on that note, I'm going to leave it there. Before this video wraps up, it's time for me to answer a Patreon question. Take it away, Dara. Today's Patreon question has been submitted by the Noodle Tube. And the Noodle Tube writes, if you could, what kind of magic would you have? To clarify, when I say magic, I mean D&D or fantasy world things that usually break the laws of nature and physics. I wanted to clarify what I meant by magic because I do know you practice magic tricks which are not the same as what I am saying here. I absolutely love this question, and truth be told, I've actually been thinking about this all week, so much so that I was actually asking friends and family about how they'd answer this question because I really wasn't sure about what to say. And having thought about it and asked a bunch of people about what magical power they'd prefer, I've settled on my preference, and my preference would be something like apparating from the Harry Potter universe. If you've not seen the Harry Potter movies or if you've not read the books, apparition is the capacity for someone to essentially teleport from one location to another more or less instantly. Now, why would I choose this as my magical power? Well, my first reason is emotional. My second one is intellectual. The emotional reason that I would choose this power is that I dearly miss my family in Ireland. Now, some people might ignorantly suggest, oh, but you know, Magic Skeptic, Ireland is only an hour's flight away from England. Yeah, you say that, but by the time you've driven to the airport, waited around for 2 hours in the airport, gotten on board the flight, so long as it wasn't delayed, thanks Ryanair. By the time you've landed and all of the business, you collect your luggage, yada, 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 by the time you've done it all, it's actually quite a sizable journey. And you know, I work for a living, so I only have a weekend, and it's quite burdensome and difficult and impractical to fly home on the weekend to see my family, and so it's quite difficult to see my loved ones, and I don't see them there as much as I would love to see them. How amazing would it be if during lunchtime at my job, at school, when I'm on my lunch break, I could just apparate to Ireland and have a cup of tea and a chat with my mother for a half an hour, and then I could be back in England instantaneously for my period 5 lesson. That would be incredible. So there's my emotional reason. My intellectual reason is that this would be an incredible tool for traveling the world and learning and just seeing what the world has to offer. Imagine being able to apparate to the Colosseum, have your morning tea in Rome, and then apparate to Egypt for lunch and see the pyramids, and then apparate to Alaska, bring a coat of course, and see what that's all about. It would just be incredible, not to mention the possibilities for space travel. Assuming I could wear some kind of a protective suit, I could apparate to the edge of the known universe. Hopefully it wouldn't be hostile to my existence. Perhaps there would be a gamble here, but I got to admit my curiosity could potentially push me to make such a decision. Our capacity to travel the universe and procure resources would be incredible. It would be awesome. And while I'm not saying I would use it for this purpose, it would also be pretty good for topping up your bank account with the money from inside the vault. But, you know, no recommendation coming from here. What's funny about that is that whatever Christian is watching this right now just concluded that, see, I told you, Magic Skeptic is an immoral atheist. All atheists want to do is sin. So, NoodleTube, I hope that's an answer that you appreciate. I promise you I give this an immense amount of thought. But yes, the power I would go for would be the ability to apparate or teleport, a lot like characters do in the Harry Potter universe. That would be awesome. But I would love to hear your thoughts, dear listener, as well as you, NoodleTube. Jump into the comments below and let me know what your chosen magical power would be. If you want to share that with me in the comments, I'd love to hear about it. I mean, if you agree with me that apparition or teleportation would be the best ability, I'd love to hear it. Or if you've thought of something that I've missed, something that you think would be far superior to the magical power I've selected, I would absolutely love to hear that as well. So do make me aware in the comments below. So thank you very much, NoodleTube, for submitting that question. I've really enjoyed thinking about it and answering it. And so, yeah, thank you very much. Let's get back to the closing of the video. Guys, thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please do leave a like on it. It costs you nothing and it helps out the channel enormously. If you like the video so much so that you'd like to leave a comment to challenge me or to agree with me or to offer some constructive criticism, please jump into the comments below and have at it. The conversation in my videos often continues for weeks after the initial upload, and I very much look forward to having that dialogue with you in the comments below. Other than that, guys, I want to extend an extra special thank you to my patrons. You guys are amazing. Your generosity consistently blows me away. Thank you so much. And if you'd like to become a patron like those I've mentioned, you will find the link to my Patreon account in the description box below. I almost got to the end without a mistake. There's got to be one, doesn't there? Anyway, folks, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.